Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to the opening talk of this year's Burren Winterage Weekend. For anyone who is tuning in for the first time to the Burren Bureau Trust event, just to let you know that this is part of our annual celebration of the farming heritage in the Burren, particularly the practice of winter grazing, which is credited with the incredible wealth of biodiversity and archaeology that we find in the Burren today. So we are very privileged that to open the celebration this year, we have some fascinating speakers. I'm joined by my colleague Brendan Dunford and the speakers for this evening, and Walter Speyer, who is a sociologist working in agricultural innovation, systems and pastoralist development. I'm also joined by Fiona Flintan, who is a senior scientist with International Livestock Research Institute. And we'll also hear from Tom Arnold, who is an agricultural economist and chair of the Irish 2030 Agri-Food Strategy Committee on Ireland's Food Vision 2030. So thank you all for joining us today. Do use the chat button to let us know where you're tuning in from. We would love to hear. We are calling from Kinvara, County Galway, and I know two of our speakers, Fiona and Anna, are calling from Germany. So we have from now until 9 p.m. We're going to hear from Anne and Fiona for the first hour, along with Brendan, and then we will hear from Tom Arnold from 8:30 onwards. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Brendan. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the Winterage Weekend first.
Yeah, thanks, Pranjali. And I might show you a few slides to begin with, because this is, as Pranjali said, the opening talk of this year's Burren Winterage Weekend. And it's a very special event to all of us here at Burren BO and in the Burren, because it's really a celebration of all the things that makes the Burren such a wonderful place to be. My own introduction to the Burren was as a student studying the relationship between farming and the landscape, and like, what a wonderful story it is. It's really fascinating. So a number of years ago, we decided to set up a little event called the Burren Winterage Weekend, because winterage, or the movement of cattle onto the hills, the limestone hills of the Burren for winter, is such a pivotal event in the farming calendar. But the practice itself is just so important to the levels of biodiversity and cultural heritage and geological heritage that we find in the Burren. And we wanted to celebrate that with an event. So about 10 years ago, this is a picture from Carron in the central Burren. We organised local farmer Willie O'Reilly to bring his 30 cattle, I think it was, from his home farm near the village up onto the winterage. And it was just a beautiful event. So that was 10 years ago, and we've been running ever since. You can move on there, Pranjali. You can see it's a lovely way to bring the cattle back onto the mountain, but also to introduce the general public to the I suppose the practice of pastoral farming in a rocky area of the west of Ireland. So it's quite educational. We can click again, Pranjali. This is a nice view from, I think, about 5 years ago, when we had maybe about 30 cattle and about 400 or 500 people following them. So it's quite labor intensive, the practice of grazing here. But also, for us, it's become a kind of a seminal event in our calendar, because within the audience there, and that picture was our Minister for Agriculture and a number of other people who are quite influential in terms of determining the future of Irish farming. And I suppose that's what we want, the message we want to portray is that these farming systems, they might produce limited amounts of high quality food, but they produce this wonderful range of ecosystem services like biodiversity, education, recreational services, cleaner water, all those wonderful things which we really have to value, particularly at a time of climate and biodiversity emergency. So one more slide, I think, Pranjali. And this is from a few years ago as well. This is just a few images. If you look at the cattle here at the top of the image and you follow the road down to the bottom and off to the right, you can see there's a line of people going back about 1 kilometre. So every year we've had more and more interest in this festival, and it's become, I suppose, an occasion where farmers from all over Ireland and Europe come together, either virtually or in real time, to celebrate winter grazing and pastoral farming. So final slide. Last year, because of COVID, we had to go virtual. So we had a real-time cattle event. This is the Casey family in Fanor. You can see them bringing their cattle up onto the hills of the Burren. And the old cattle routes being reenacted. So we filmed that and shared it with our global audience last year. So this year we're back to a real-time event in terms of the cattle drove this Sunday, and we hope some of you can join us by booking on that. But tonight, what we wanted to do was to sort of reach out to our global audience and to the global practice of transhumance and pastoralism, because what is happening here in the Burren as part of the Winterage Festival is reenacted across space and time, if you like. It's been going on for hundreds and thousands of years across geographies, right across the globe. And tonight I wanted to kind of connect you all with two people who I think are doing amazing work in celebrating and sharing the story of pastoralism and transhumance. And they are Fiona, who's calling from Rome, and also Anne, I think, who's calling us from Germany tonight. So what I wanted to do is just have a chat with Fiona and Anne about themselves, their journey in terms of how they got doing what they're doing, and also what they feel is sort of the importance and the bigger picture around pastoralism. So I might start with Fiona. Fiona, if you can hear me, I think you grew up obviously in Europe, but how did you get working in Africa with pastoralists and rangelands?
Thanks, Brendan. So I'm going to answer with a few photos to make it a bit more interesting. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Here we go. So there's wee little Fiona. I was very privileged in having a life of travel and space and countryside, and including several visits to Ireland for summer holidays. And then my parents bought a small cottage in Kashamara on the coast. And so right from the beginning, including my Irish heritage, I have a strong connection with Ireland. So it's actually a real privilege for me to be part of this gathering tonight, taking me back to my roots, actually. So yeah, kind of from the age of 10, actually. Before that, I was kind of living in suburban Surrey, south of London. But from the age of 10, I moved to living on a farm. And through my teenage years, I was basically brought up on a farm in Sussex and then Kent. And I think this is probably where I started making that connection with livestock and the environment. Kind of in my early 20s, I started traveling. So my journey to working in pastoral areas hasn't been linear. When I came out of school, I trained as a chef and was cooking and working in a restaurant for several years. But then I started traveling, and I was able to save money and travel around the world. And I think this began to expose me to the issues around the world, and particularly from the environmental perspective, I was getting more and more interested in these issues. So at the age of 29, 28 or 27, maybe it's 27, I went to agriculture college. I went to Y College, and then I went to SOAS, University of London. And then after that, so that was when I was about 30 years old. Having had this kind of quite shift in my career, it was kind of like, okay, what do I do next? I have a master's degree, but I don't have a great deal of practical experience. How do I get to Africa? How do I start building that experience up in development work? So actually the opportunity came up for me to be based at UCC. At that time, there was what was called the International Famine Center. One of the lecturers at UCC was involved in this and had been my professor at Y College. So he was the connection. And in fact, I was based in Cork for 5 years. The original plan was for me to do a PhD. So I was doing a PhD and also at UCC, and also working at the International Famine Center. This took me to Ethiopia. this took me to the Bali Mountains in Ethiopia. The subject of my PhD was basically to kind of like look at the political economy around the establishment of this national park, the Bali Mountains National Park in Ethiopia. I was working with the World Wildlife Fund at the time, and they were particularly interested in me looking at gender issues, and I kind of did that alongside the PhD work. And gradually I was getting more with my time there. I realized what a fascinating country Ethiopia was. I started to understand some of the issues. I started to make connections with different people during my time there. And unfortunately, I kind of got more and more drawn into Ethiopia, unfortunately, but unfortunately for the PhD, I kind of got pulled more and more into Ethiopia, more and more into different aspects of the work. Actually here, I forgot to say, actually, the Bali Mountains actually has a very interesting vertical transhumance called the Gadantu system, which is basically livestock being taken up and down the mountains. The livestock is brought down during the summer season to have the shade of the trees and the forest grazing, and then actually taken up during the wet season to the more mountain areas during that time. So almost a similar kind of vertical transhumance as you have in Ireland. But yes, I basically kind of got diverted from my PhD and got a grant to begin looking at gender and conservation and development projects, including in pastoral areas. And this took me to a few different countries. Zanzibar was the first place, Vietnam, Namibia, and then also Ethiopia. And I think actually this was when, sorry for the dog noise, this was when I first met Anne, I think, during this period, when I was kind of like looking at gender and pastoralism and conservation and use of natural resources. And this I think was probably where I was really kind of veering onto the pastoralism and the use of natural resources, issues of land tenure, mobility and how to protect mobility, these kind of aspects. One very important event in my life was attending a workshop on transforming conflict, on conflict transformation. This was a workshop that was held it was a 5-week training that was held in South Africa. And it really introduced me to people who were kind of on the front line of dealing with conflicts. Amongst this group of people were some amazing Somali ladies, pastoralist ladies, who were working in the pastoral areas, but really trying to introduce more aspects of peace and bringing in kind of activities like peace crusades, peace groups, and really trying to turn around the conflict that was in those pastoral areas. And for me personally, it was a very life-changing experience to be part of this process for 5 weeks. And really, I think, again, kind of added to that whole kind of shift in my thinking and drawing my attention to the issues of pastoral areas in Africa. And yeah, this basically kind of brought me to working in the pastoral areas of Ethiopia. So it was kind of a bit of a wobbly and not very linear journey, but that is basically how I got there.
It's really interesting, Fiona, and what a journey. I mean, what a life journey it's been, and some of the images there and some of the stories about instances rather about the transhumance, the vertical transhumance are fascinating. So we'll come back to it, but maybe to bring Anne in. And I think you grew up in Canada, did you? So how did you get to working in Africa with pastoralists and rangelands?
Yeah, I grew up in Winnipeg, that's in the middle of North America. And actually, I did my first studies in languages and literature. And then I got a scholarship to go to Germany. And that's where I met Wolfgang, who eventually became my husband. And he was studying what he called cowboy sciences. I guess to be politically correct today, you'd say cow person scientists. And he wanted to work in Africa and we wanted to stay together. So I switched my studies and went into agricultural sociology and economics. And so we were working in Tanzania and in Tunisia and Sudan. And that's where I got to know for the first time small scale crop farmers and also transhumant Fulani, or the livestock keepers of various ethnic groups. And I really got to appreciate their rich knowledge and their ways of dealing with seasonality and with unpredictable climatic conditions. Yeah, that was our first tropical experience. And then our next one was tropical Australia. And that's where Wolfgang had a postdoc. And then, seeing these rangelands and these ranches in Northern Australia, I started to reflect on what agricultural productivity really means. And I was comparing the productivity of pastoral systems in southern Sudan, where we've just been, and in Northern Australia, where we were. And I found that calculated per unit area of land, the so-called traditional, often referred to as backward systems of pastoralism in southern Sudan were actually more productive than the more modern ones in Northern Australia. There was a difference in productivity per unit of labor, per working person, where Australia was more productive. But it really became obvious to me that the pastoral system in southern Sudan was supporting many, many more people than the one in Northern Australia. It was producing meat and milk and blood for food. And there were also all sorts of other products like skins and bones and horns and manure that were being used by people in many different ways. By the way, there are some slides that go with this, but somehow they don't seem to be appearing yet.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, Fiona, I didn't know you were ready to show them. I'll show them now.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah. Well, that was the first bit, and then we can move on to slide number 2, because I was talking about comparing Australia. Move on to the next one. Yeah. I was talking about comparing Northern Australia and Southern Sudan. And this comparison really encouraged me to look more closely at traditional farming systems, trying to understand what makes them work. Okay, also what could make them work better, but not trying to replace them by modern systems that demand high levels of inputs based on fossil fuels, clearly non-sustainable and not locally appropriate. So after Australia, we're already there in the slides, Wolfgang and I went to central Nigeria, and we started working with the International Livestock Center for Africa, which later became part of ILRI, which is the organization that Fiona is with. We were involved in livestock systems research without a research station. We were in a team trying to understand the traditional systems and to work together with the livestock keepers, Fulani, pastoralists, in exploring ways to improve these systems. And in that situation, we had no choice but to work in a participatory research mode, because the animals belong to the Fulani And the use of the land that was being grazed and sometimes cropped seasonally was negotiated by the immigrant Fulani with the indigenous crop farmers. So that meant that Fulani, not the researchers, had to make all of the decisions about how the animals and the land were being used in the joint experimentation. And our task as researchers, we suggested ideas, we observed what the Fulani did with the ideas, we discussed it with them, and together we found out what works and what doesn't work and why. Now this research, we could go to the next slide, required an understanding of how the pastoral system of the Fulani, who are normally using this area only for dry season grazing in Transhumance, how this was intertwined with the farming systems of the local non-Fulani people, and how arrangements between these different ethnic groups were being made to use land for different purposes at different times of the year. The Fulani livestock grazed stubble harvested fields of the crop farmers and provided manure as fertilizer, as you can see in my black and white photo. And the herders were extremely skilled in guiding the animals to patches of good grazing and keeping them out of the crops, including the irrigated gardens and the plant nurseries in the dry season. So they were settled, and next slide, and semi-settled and nomadic Fulani groups, but all of them practice some form of transhumance, in long distance, short distance, with at least part of their herds. And that was to make the optimal use of natural resources in areas with very distinct wet and dry seasons. And really what was very interesting for me as a sociologist was to see the innovative ways in which the Fulani men and women were so creative in developing new and better ways of doing things in our joint research, but also in their daily lives and the way they marketed their produce. In other words, I was observing local innovation, endogenous development, that's development that comes from within the community. So then, after leaving Nigeria, that was in the mid-80s, I became involved in promoting local innovation and farmer-led research and development in different parts of Africa, also training and mentoring students and researchers and development actors, and documenting and publishing about these. Could go to the next slide. The publications about livestock systems were mainly with my husband, Wolfgang, and the publications about local innovation and about ecological farming were mainly with my colleagues in the Information Center for Low External Input and Sustainable Agriculture, ILEA for short. That's where I worked, and it was hosted by a Dutch NGO based in the Netherlands, being Dutch, and it was called ETC Foundation. ETC also set up a network called ProLinova, promoting local innovation in ecologically oriented agriculture and natural resource management. I was actually involved in this from the very outset, from 1999. And this brought me to different countries in Africa and Asia. And it was on one of those trips to advise projects working on farmer-led participatory research and pastoralist development in Ethiopia that I met Fiona. And we discovered our shared passion for our work with pastoralists, and we've been in touch with each other and collaborating ever since.
Gosh, that's terrific, and it's fascinating, and it's fascinating how many parallels there are, across these different countries and places, and how we've got to where we are in all our different journeys. Because I think here in the Burren as well, we would have been very much listening to the voice of the farmer and harnessing the knowledge of the farmer in the ways and learning about ways in which those farming communities have adapted to the kind of local geographies and limitations around water and so on and so forth. So it's quite fascinating, the parallels. I might pop back to Fiona for a minute. Fiona, you spoke about Ethiopia there, but I think you've also worked in some other places, and even to the degree that you apparently are farming with one cow in Tanzania. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Okay, so yes, I mean, from Ethiopia, I was lucky to kind of use it as a base to travel to other places, which actually invariably involved being dressed up in different local clothes. So here are a few examples from Ethiopia, from Tanzania, and from Kyrgyzstan, where I've been quite recently. But yeah, I was very lucky in that I was able to visit other places. But really, most of my work in the recent years has been focused on Tanzania. So in Tanzania, all land belongs to the state, and pastoralists and other land users basically have use rights to the land. Tanzanian policy and legislation says that every village should have a village land use plan. And then this village land use plan is basically used for, the idea is that each village will zone, will choose kind of priority uses zones for the different land uses in their village. And then this will be used as a basis for that use going forward and for encouraging investments into that use. So the problem is when you start creating or like formalizing a individual village land use plan, you can start putting up kind of virtual boundaries around the village. And when you have a system like pastoralism that needs to work across a larger area than a village, by formalizing those village boundaries, it can begin to put up barriers to the mobility that's needed across village boundaries. I mean, it's the same perhaps in Europe when we start putting up boundaries around villages and administrations, having budgets and fiscal control and movement control within villages. It starts to create barriers between mentally, but also physically, between neighboring villages, etc., and disturbs that kind of traditional movement that's already been there. So in Tanzania, this was the case. So ILRI was involved in a project there that was trying to support more sustainable rangeland management. And one of the things we were looking at was how to support the process of village land use planning, which we saw as important for reconciling land use conflicts. But at the same time to ensure that the sharing of resources that's so important for pastoral communities was preserved, such as water points or grazing lands. And basically what we did was we worked with the policy and legislation to develop a process of joint village land use planning. So where villages still produce their own individual village land use plan, but where they shared resources with other villages, they planned together. So here we have 4 villages. We have this one here, 2, 3, and 4. And basically, traditionally, they've all shared this light green, which is the shared grazing land, traditionally. If they had just gone for their own individual village land use plan without talking to the other villages, they might have not ensured that this shared grazing land remained joined up. But by us supporting them to plan together, it enabled a more contiguous grazing land across the village boundaries. And it also then, apart from their individual village land use plans, we supported them to produce a joint village land use agreement, which meant now that none of these villages can change their individual land use plans without, and change the boundaries of this shared grazing land without permission from or agreement from all 4 villages. Otherwise, they would have to leave the agreement as such. And then on top of that, once this had been formalized within the village land use plan, so this is now it's a government process, and the villages secure a relative degree of security by having this in the village land use plan and formalized, so then they can move on to actually issuing land holding certificates. And in Tanzania, the lowest level of government is the village council. The village council is voted by the local communities, and it's the village council that have the authority to issue land holding certificates to the members of their village. So this process now enabled them to do that. We actually repeated this in 4 other clusters of villages, and this pale green is the grazing land that was protected through those village land use plans. And you can see it gradually was building up to quite a large landscape of grazing across a very large area. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of hectares here. And then the communities were able to receive land holding certificates, use certificates for that shared grazing area. Livestock Keepers Association was established, and they managed to receive community certificates of customary rights of occupancy for that land. So this was the work that I've been involved in Tanzania for the last few years. And I think a lot of it probably, though we're talking about a different context, a lot of the principles resonate, I think, with planning processes that we see in Europe as well. You know, the idea of putting up boundaries around administrative units, which then might disturb what were traditional sharing and collective use across those boundaries. I was lucky enough to go back there actually in December, back to the villages, and there was a big party organized to celebrate the work that had been achieved. And yes, indeed, I was presented with my own heifer called Bella, who is still happily there in the village, and I get regular updates by WhatsApp from neighbours about her progress, and she's doing well. So I'm hoping that she will very shortly have some offspring, which will be a further celebration. But yeah.
So you're not just a farmer, you're an expanding farmer. You're growing your herd, Fiona. That's fantastic. I want to come back to the issue of maybe conflict resolution a little bit later, because I think it is in Europe a time of growing conflict, I guess, between interests around farming and the environment, for example. But just maybe tell us a little bit more about your current work, Fiona, with the International Livestock Research Institute and what that entails.
Sure. I mean, increasingly, the work that I've been doing has taken on a more global perspective. This really started off with work that I was doing with the International Land Coalition. That is a network of organizations, from UN agencies to research organizations to local civil society organizations, all working on securing land rights for the poor and others across the world. I coordinated a Rangelands initiative for them. One of the very first things that we did was to organize learning routes, which is basically a journey visiting different communities to learn from them about how they secured land in different contexts. It wasn't just a learning, it was very much a place where the participants on that journey could actually come out of their normal day life, whether they were governments here or IFAD here, or someone from Niger meeting someone from Kenya, or someone from Kyrgyzstan meeting someone from India. It really took people out of their normal context to actually reflect on the work that they were doing, and also learning at the same time from communities about what they were doing, and to take that back into their own work. So this was one of the first shifts to working more at a global level. And these learning journeys, I think, were really useful in helping to begin to create kind of a critical mass of people basically in East Africa who were coming from different perspectives, but were all interested in coming together to support taking lessons from around the world into their own work, but also globally. And another aspect of the work that I was doing was kind of to try and raise the issues of rangelands within forums that wouldn't necessarily or weren't paying enough attention to rangelands. So for example, something like the Global Landscapes Forum, which is a platform that's got increasing attention. It's now very much involved in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, but it's been very forest focused. And I think within the rangelands work, we've seen that forests get an awful lot of attention, but rangelands don't. So within this, I was trying to promote that rangelands and grasslands need as much attention as forests. Then most recently, I've been involved in putting together a rangelands atlas. It was a very simple process. We basically combined global data sets, but it's been very useful in at least having some figure that's been based on a process to say how much area of the world is rangelands. So very crudely, very broadly, and based on World Wildlife Fund categorization, we can now say that 54% of terrestrial area, very broadly, is rangelands. This is rangelands, and we picked categories that we felt reflected rangelands. One problem of that was that we didn't go down to the next level of detail, which was a much more detailed categorization. And what we have seen is that some people have said, you know, we're missing some areas, whereas we're including some ecozones that perhaps are not rangelands. So this is kind of the next step to go that. And looking at Ireland there, we're not including anything that we would have categorized as rangelands. And as in Germany and other parts of Europe, some of these areas, they're classified as, according to WWF, they've been classified as ecozones that are not falling within what we're using to categorize rangelands. So now the next step is to go back and see what that was. But at least it was a starting point. It was a very crude process, but it's been getting a lot of global attention, and it's all part of this process of raising the profile of rangelands globally.
Fiona, could you give us just a quick, simple definition for those in the audience tonight who aren't familiar with the term rangelands? What does it mean?
So, I mean, we define them in the atlas here, which is basically land. I hope I get this right. But basically, land that's dominated by grasses, shrublands, or other vegetation that is being grazed by livestock or wildlife, or has the potential to be grazed by livestock and wildlife. And this, basically in this categorization, it includes grasslands as well as deserts, shrublands, etc.
Okay, well, definitely you can include the Burren then. Sorry to interrupt if you want to carry on.
Exactly. Well, that was it. And I would just add, there is a global movement on rangelands to raise the profile, with grasslands as part of it. These are some of the things that I'm involved in. I think I've been connecting with some people probably on this call, on this meeting, through Instagram, also Twitter, and also there's the Pastoralist Knowledge Hub. So if people in the audience do want to join others and be part of a knowledge hub on pastoralism and rangelands, this is probably the most centralized one here. And we'll talk about some others, but please, if you, that's spelled wrong, that should be CGIAR. But if anyone wants any more information from me personally, you can contact me through here.
And I'd encourage people as well to any questions they might have for Fiona, and then put them in the Q&A box. We'll have 15-20 minutes for questions in a moment. I wanted to come back to Anne, who is now officially retired after decades in R&D. So what does retirement look like, Anne, and what kind of project have you got on at the moment in your retirement?
I did retire from ETC, 7 years ago, after working with them for 25 years. And yeah, I was passionate about what I'm doing. I'm still passionate about it. It's my life, and it's what I've continued to be active in. And that's why you still see this slide about trolling over and promoting innovation, because that's what I'm still doing. But in addition to that, I've become much more involved in advocacy activities, advocating for policies that encourage participatory approaches in agricultural research and development, but also advocating for policies that facilitate mobile, transhumant systems of livestock production, so that the pastoralists can continue to make efficient use of the resources that are really quite diversely spread over time and space to produce healthy food using livestock. Now, at the beginning of my retirement, most of my advocacy activities were centered around Eastern Africa. I'm part of a coalition of European lobbies for Eastern African pastoralism. It's called CELEP. And I manage the website and a lot of the outreach and publication activities. But then through that, one of our big activities has been the Pastoralist Films Festival, Perspectives on Pastoralism. And it was through this film festival that I discovered your film on winterage. It was called The Cattle Drove. And yeah, I was fascinated by this form of transhumance. I had never known anything about it before. And we've shown the film a number of times. It's on our film festival website, and it's also on the website for the International Year for Rangelands and Pastoralism. And it's going to be shown next week again at the International Grassland.
I can get into this.
There's a flyer for it. I think if you go to the next slide, you'll see the flyer for that particular film festival, which is going to be shown next week with your film is in it. Yeah. And then we could go to the next slide. Through the CELEP activities, I became involved in a campaign for the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, the IYRP. And we're hoping that the UN General Assembly will approve this later this year, within a few weeks. And the Burren program is among the 300 organizations that have supported the proposal for this international year made by the Mongolian government. And your film, as I mentioned, is on this website here that you see. And it was then through this campaign for the international year that I got drawn into, you can show the next slide. It was something called the gap analysis. It was mandated by the United Nations Environment Program. And we were supposed to identify gaps in knowledge about rangeland and pastoralists worldwide. You know, in most statistics, there's no differentiation made between the industrial livestock production and the more close to nature livestock production. And so there's some very generalized narratives that really give a bad name for livestock. So pastoralists themselves need to have more data about how they are contributing to the economy and to the environment. And we, all of us actually, we need more data on how multi-purpose land use systems can provide a higher total benefits than can a land use system that is only for one purpose. And what are the kind of land tenure systems and the policies that are needed for this? And this is an issue that actually is going to become more important now, increasingly important, as there's this rush for green energy, for sparsely populated land to generate solar and wind energy. And pastoralists are using this land. Many parts of these lands that are being foreseen and already being used for green energy. And they should not be unnecessarily and actually unrightfully ousted from their seasonal grazing areas. It's possible coexistence between green energy and pastoralism, just like it's possible to have coexistence between pastoralism and wildlife. So a major part of the IYRP activities will be to encourage research that fills knowledge gaps about this kind of thing and raises awareness about these issues. And that's why right now we're really focusing on trying to get as many governments as possible, including the Irish, within the next few weeks to support the proposal of the Mongolian government to have an international year of rangelands and pastoralists in 2026.
I think that's really fascinating, and I think maybe we can all lend our support to that, and I might come back to that in a moment before we go to questions. But can I ask you something about, again, trying to draw common lines between your experiences in Africa and Australia and what's happening here? There does seem to be that growing kind of potential conflict between the interests of the pastoralists and those maybe of possibly around climate and around both carbon sequestration and afforestation and wind energy, like you said. But one other issue is the whole economics, the social economy as well. What is is there issues around succession? Are younger people willing to continue practicing these pastoral traditions given the potentially poor economic returns and the, I suppose, the pressures, the ever increasing pressures it would appear in these systems? Is there an issue around keeping the new generations coming through?
Are you posing that to me or are you posing it to Fiona?
I'll start with you, Anne. I think
with me. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when I first started working with pastoralists, I was always hearing that there was no future for pastoralism. And it would die out within the next generation or two. And people still say that, but it is continuing. And there are people that really want to stay in pastoralism. And indeed, in Europe, there are people from city areas, young people going into herding, into pastoralism with sheep or with goats. There's even a pastoralism school. So I do think it's going to continue I've been working on this now for, 50 years. Yeah, no, for 45 years. And I can imagine, okay, there's going to be a lot of changes, a lot of innovations, but there will be pastoralism in the next 45 years. And I think there are, there's a picture I think I showed that you have of a young Fulani herder. And we've even got a film, which we have, an animated film that we have. Maybe you can show that picture. Do you have the
We
slide?
can possibly put a link in. Yeah.
Yeah?
But do you think, Anne, that pastoralism almost needs to reinvent itself in terms of what it's offering? I mean, I guess traditionally it was a way of existing and producing some level of food, but I know in Spain, for instance, now pastoralists, at least some of them, are being paid by local governments to graze back areas as a way of preventing fires. I also know that pastoralism in some parts obviously has huge recreational and I suppose value for tourism industries, because it's such an authentic practice and people like to witness that. So is there a need to reimagine pastoralism and what it's offering? I know you're partly doing that, but the economics of it, is there a way of reimagining in a way that makes the economic reality much stronger?
I think the economics of it, the most convincing things, at least in countries such as in Africa and a lot of Asian countries, is still going to be the economic argument. I really think so. But you've got to look at the economics and the total value of the system, which is much more than just what you get by selling the meat or the milk. And there's the environmental economics involved. There's the social economics involved. There's a lot of other things which are normally not taken into account in an economic assessment. And of course, it's going to be different for different countries, different parts of the world. I think in Europe, it's much further ahead in that pastoralists can benefit from their contribution to the environment. You don't have that yet in a number of other countries, especially in Africa. I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, Fiona, because you have worked quite a bit with youth in pastoral systems.
Sure. Yes, to a degree. I think the issues in Africa and Europe are different. Or I mean, in developing countries and more developed countries in Europe are different. I think in say, for example, in Africa, as you're saying, Anne, pastoralism, the very nature of the land and the environment means that pastoralism will exist probably for eternity, because there are lands there that cannot be used for anything else. I mean, if you take kind of the rocky terrain of Afar region, for example, you just can't use that land for anything else apart from grazing sheep and goats. And I think from what I've seen is that families, pastoralists are astute people, and they're hedging their bets, and families what we are seeing is that families are kind of getting split up more. Some part of the family, including the husband or male elder sons, will be going off to Djibouti or even further afield to find work as laborers, etc. Whereas other parts of the family will be remaining at home. Some will be educated, some will not, some will be working with the livestock, some will be maybe working in a shop or even setting up a shop or some kind of small enterprise. So I think what we're seeing in Africa is kind of more diversification where it's possible. In Europe, it's been very interesting to be back in Europe and getting really kind of getting to understand European pastoralism more. When I was here previously, I wasn't really focused so much on pastoralism, so it's been very interesting to come back. And we made a small film about pastoralism in Italy, and in that we did seek out young people, But what we did find was a lot of young people that really are very committed to and seeing opportunities in pastoralism going forward. I think one thing that has helped, I think, has been social media. I shared my Instagram address earlier. I only started Instagram in January. You know, I'm a bit behind the times, but it's been a really interesting way of connecting with individuals all around the world, young and old, who are working in pastoralism, whether it's on regenerative grazing in California, through to young people in Lithuania or wherever. It's been a really interesting way. And actually today, you know, I saw something, a chat in Instagram, which I think, you know, it kind of reflects some of the issues. It was a conversation between a guy who's visiting Spain. He's gone to a very abandoned pastoral village, what was more of a farming pastoral village in the mountains of Spain, which had basically been abandoned. And he was talking to a young local shepherd there and said, you know, what do you feel about the fact that this village has been abandoned and there's the population has disappeared from here? And this young shepherd said, well, in fact, you know, it's actually been to our advantage, because now as a young person, I can come back to this village and I can now afford to buy a piece of land or buy a house and have access to this land. So there are these different trends and changes happening, but my feeling is that pastoralists are not just pastoralists for economic reasons, or not just pastoralists because this is a job. This is the people who have that relationship with livestock do it because of that relationship, and somehow they will make the system work for them, even if it's difficult, even if it's challenging, even if there's hurdles to jump, even if they're marginalized, there will be some way that they will find it work. And as long as that is still possible, I think that pastoralism and livestock keeping will continue.
We're almost at the end of time. I just have one last question for the two of you, and then I might hand back to Pranjali if there's a few comments maybe. One is a quick response to a huge question, but is climate change having an impact on the pastoralists that you work with, and what form does that take? And secondly, is there anything we can do here in Ireland in terms of advocacy in support of pastoralism and rangelands? So maybe to start with you first, Anne, and then we'll give the last word to Fiona.
Yeah, I mean, climate change is affecting everybody, but I do think that pastoralists, because of their tradition of handling extremes and uncertainties as far as climate is concerned, weather is concerned, they can handle that actually much better than people that are trying to stay in one place. So we could probably learn a lot from how pastoralists are dealing with this high uncertainty in their flexibility in using resources. Yeah. And just very briefly, because we don't have much time left, I would like to say I really, really appreciate already what the Burren program is doing in advocating for pastoralism, for transhumance. And I really feel that you are giving a very good example also with this festival. And we appreciate very much that you have supported the Mongolian proposal for the International Year, that you are part of the European support group for the International Year. And we really congratulate you and hope that you give your good example will be taken up by others in other parts of the world.
Thank you. And we'll have more information on the website about that. And I love your images there, and they're just stunning. I think they're just amazing. I'd love to visit some of those places. Maybe across to you, Fiona, for the last word, both on, you know, this issue of climate and how it's impacting on on pastoralism, and also maybe any advocacy support or advice you might give us here.
Well, really, I don't think I can add much to what Anne said. I think she took the words out of my mouth, certainly from a climate change perspective. But yes, I mean, there are different ways to get involved. It is a global movement on rangelands that is increasingly getting stronger. So we've given you some ideas how to get involved. If you didn't get those emails and websites, Instagram, etc., then if they can write to you, Brendan, and you can put them in touch, please do. So yes, yeah, I wouldn't really add any more, apart from the fact I hope one day I can come and join the Burren Transhumance.
Well, I think you feel very much at home, because like the parallels are both striking and wonderful. I think just the images of the people, the cultures, the colors, the places, the animals, it's fantastic. And I think we here in the Burren are very proud of our pastoralists and their traditions as well, and all that they've yielded for not just Burren society, but our society. And it's thrilling to hear from you both about how that happens at a global level. And congratulations to you both on the wonderful work you've done for decades now, collectively, and in supporting a cause. I can't think of a more worthy cause, because it's got it all really there. So thank you both for a wonderful presentation. Pranjali, did you want to, before we go to Tom, did you want to share any comments or questions?
Thanks, Anne and Fiona. Anne, you requested me to. Sorry, I've probably not been very prompt at sharing your slides. That's a beautiful one. Do you want to say anything about it?
No, I'm just, that was what I was referring to. There's a future in pastoralism, and there's people that are enjoying it and are doing it well.
That's wonderful. Really interesting to hear about pastoralism in other countries. I was particularly struck by the one in Ethiopia, Fiona, to know that there's other groups that are herding their livestock up on the hills in the wintertime, just like here in the Burren. So that was fascinating. This webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available on YouTube for anyone who wants to watch or share it with their friends or contacts. It's a great resource for us all to have. Thank you also to the audience. There have been people tuning in from North Carolina, York in UK, Lithuania, Ethiopia, Germany. So fantastic to get the whole range of audience there. There's one question there for possibly Anne or Fiona, but maybe because we're running out of time, maybe you can text the answer back in the chat window about the change in land use and whether that affects the pastoralism over the years. And so I'll let you answer that on text. And if you have any more questions for either Anne or Fiona, maybe put them into the Q&A button. And even if they don't have time to answer them, they might text the answers back to you. So with that, I think we're ready to move to Tom. Brendan, Tom, thank you very much for joining us today.
Exactly. We're delighted to have Tom with us, because I can't think of anybody more suitable to kind of follow on from that, because Tom, many of you might know Tom. He's got a strong background in agriculture and economics, but he was also very involved in Concern, a wonderful organization here in Ireland, which does a lot of work in the developing world. And Tom is also very involved in looking forward to the future of Irish farming through his work as chairman of the Agri-Food strategy. So I think we're delighted to have you here, Tom, with us tonight, and I hope you enjoyed that presentation as much as I did, at least. And maybe we'll ask you to kind of bring it all back home now to respond to that, and maybe to look to the future here in Ireland for pastoralism and for sustainable farming. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Well, I enjoyed those two presentations from Fiona and Anne enormously, and it's a real honour to be on the same platform as them, and indeed to be part of this opening session for the 2021 Burren Winterage Weekend. Fiona and Anne both started with their personal stories to explain how they became engaged in what became for each of them their life's passion. And I also want to start with a personal story about how I became interested in the Burren. I then want to situate the Burren project within Food Vision 2030, the Agri-Food strategy which the government has committed to follow over the next decade. And I will conclude by connecting Food Vision 2030 to what's happening at international level, specifically to the UN Food Systems Summit, which took place last month in New York. I will comment on what Fiona and Anne have said, at least briefly, and try to link their hopes and ambitions to what emerged from the Food Systems Summit. And I'll try to do all this as concisely as possible, so there may be some time for discussions. My interest in the Burren has been mediated through three remarkable people who have been my friends. Marcus McInerney, Michael McGrath, and you, Brendan Dufford. I want to speak briefly about each of them. Marcus was my lecturer in agricultural economics in UCD in the early 1970s. His background was in international development, having worked with the US Embassy in Dublin during the 1960s. Under his supervision, I did a substantial project on the subject economic development in the Third World, and this set me on the path that I followed over the next 50 years. I'm getting some technical advice here from the red corner. In 1973, Ireland became a member of the European Economic Community, the EEC, and that proud Clareman, Dr. Paddy Hillary, became the first Irish commissioner. Marcus joined his cabinet as the agricultural advisor. In September 1973, I had the privilege of also joining the cabinet as a stagiaire or intern, working to Marcus. It was an exciting time, seeing up close how the EEC worked and how Ireland was taking its first steps on its European journey. I had a great regard for Dr. Hillary as a political leader and a committed European. I was pleased to be able to tell him that his nephew Michael and I had been in UCD together and were firm friends. 10 years on, I was to work closely with Michael in ACOT, the Farm Advisory Service. Marcus had a distinguished career in the Commission. His thinking about the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, was way ahead of his time. When Ireland was hooked on the intervention system for beef and dairy products, a condition that lasted for the first 2 decades of our EEC membership, Marcus was looking to the day when the CAP would support farmers to farm in a more nature-friendly way. When he retired from the Commission, he had great plans to work that way himself on his farm in Tulla. Sadly, he did not get the time to do that. I left the Commission in 1983 to come back to Ireland and to work as senior economist in ACOT, the Farm Advisory Service. It was a moment of great change in Irish farming, with the milk quota being introduced in 1984. Each county had its chief agricultural officer, the CAO, people who held sway in their own county and could use their influence for good to a greater or lesser effect. Michael McGrath was the recently appointed CAO in County Clare. I got to know him well. I observed his great capacity to provide leadership within the farming community. The Burren was one of his main preoccupations, and he was a great champion for the people who farmed there and the communities they were part of. He spoke frequently of the quality of local leadership, including the IFA, working to improve the lives and livelihoods of the people. The name of Michael Daverin was frequently mentioned. Michael has many qualities, but he's particularly endowed with the quality of persistence. And that persistence was applied as a champion for the Burren to politicians, to people in the Department of Agriculture, to Brussels officials, indeed to anyone who was prepared to listen to him. At a certain moment, he started to tell me about a highly impressive young man who was doing his PhD on farming systems in the Burren. His name was Brendan Dufford. So on a glorious summer day about 20 years ago, Brendan brought myself, my wife Gillian, and our son Patrick as well as Marcus and Michael, on a walk in the Burren. He demonstrated that day his detailed knowledge of the Burren's ecology and farming system, but his particular passion was how this knowledge might be applied to improve the lives of the people and communities of the Burren. Sometime later, Brendan phoned me to say he planned to establish the Burren Bio Trust and asked, would I become one of its patrons? I mildly protested, saying that I probably couldn't contribute much as a patron, as I didn't really know very much about the Burren. But just out of interest, I asked, who else has agreed to become patrons? Oh, he said, Seamus Heaney, David Bellamy, and some others. Well, if that was the company Brendan was asking me to keep as a patron of Burren Bio, the answer to accept was very easy. So the Burren project started to take form and to secure funding from different sources. I'm going to use one slide in this presentation, and I'd like now to show this to be shown. And that really is, it's called a Burren timeline. And it tells the different stages of how the Burren project have developed effectively over the last 25 to almost 30 years. Brendan's PhD was a critical stage along that way. The Burren Life Research Project from 2005 to 2010 was of critical importance because here this attracted support from the EU Commission and helped to basically test the proposition that there could be improved farming systems in the Burren. And that has been followed up by other supporter plans with support from the Department of Agriculture and the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And we are now at the point where Brendan is hoping to get yet another support from at national level. So this really leads me on to say that, you know, over this period of time, the Burren was recognized as somewhere where innovative work was going on, which provided lessons for certain other parts of the country. And Brendan's views, based on his experience, was increasingly sought after at national and international level. So this brings me on to talk about Food Vision 2030, how it was developed and what are its outcomes. Since 2000, Ireland has had 5 stakeholder-led agri-food strategies, the most recent of which was Foodwise 2025. They each reflected the context in which they were drawn up and the priorities of the time. In November 2019, a new stakeholder committee was appointed to draw up an agri-food strategy up to 2030, and I was asked to chair it. There were 32 members on the committee, and I was delighted to find out that Brendan was one of those. The terms of reference given to our committee were clear. We were asked to draw up a strategy with associated policies aimed at the agri-food sector, achieving economic, environmental, and social sustainability by 2030. Just as we started our work, the COVID pandemic arrived, and this became an additional factor to take account of. We produced a draft report in April 2021 and finalized it after a period of public consultation in July. The government adopted it and launched it in August. The central recommendation of Food Vision 2030 is that Ireland should become a world leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade. This represents high ambition and will be a challenging objective to achieve. Food Vision 2030 has some continuities with earlier agri-food strategies, but it represents significant change in a number of important ways. The strategy was developed using a food systems approach, which recognizes the interconnectedness of policies for agri-food, the environment, and nutrition and health. This approach acknowledges that all actors along the food chain, from farm to fork, have a key role to play in developing a sustainable food system. There are other important innovations by comparison to earlier strategies. There is a strong focus on the agri-environment, proposals for increased carbon sequestration, and the generation of on-farm renewable energy. Primary producers, farmers, fishers, and forestry owners are fundamental to the strategy and are the foundation of the entire sector. The linkage between agri-food policies to those of nutrition and health is an important innovation. There is increased emphasis on social sustainability and the need for greater investment in community-based development. And this will become of even greater importance as we hopefully move to the post-COVID era, and many people look creatively at where and how they want to work in the future. There's one further innovation of note: the proposal that Ireland's domestic policy on sustainable food systems should be reflected in our foreign and development cooperation policy. And this leads to what I want to talk about in my concluding remarks. How does our Food Vision 2030 strategy connect with policies at international level, and in particular with the Food Systems Summit, which took place in New York last month? World Food Summits are rare events. There have been only 6 over the past 80 years. Remarkably, the first such summit took place in 1943 during the Second World War. It led to the establishment of the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, which was to become one of the 4 key pillars of the post-war order, along with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later to become the World Trade Organization. And the establishment of the FAO was a recognition that the world in the post-war era was going to face major issues about food and its adequate supply. The Food Systems Summit of 2021 was actually announced in September 2019 by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. At the summit itself, our President, Michael D. Higgins, made the formal national statement on behalf of Ireland. He said that the calling of the summit was based on the profound insight that sustainable food systems were of central importance to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which in essence represents the world's global development agenda. I don't have time this evening to discuss the detailed outcomes of the summit, but its most important outcome is that leaders of some 100 countries, presidents and prime ministers, committed that their countries would work towards sustainable food systems over the next decade. This won't be easy. There will be difficult choices as between different farming interest groups. Many countries will need assistance in developing their sustainable food systems. Given its own experience of change in recent decades, Ireland is in a position to provide that assistance and is also committed through its foreign policy and its aid policy to do so. I have a few concluding remarks. What you have done in the Burren project over the past quarter century is not just important locally, but is of national, European, and global significance. Each of my 3 remarkable friends played their own important role. Marcus, were he still with us, would be proud of what has been achieved. Michael and Brendan should be proud. But each of the 3 would immediately deflect attention from themselves to the people and communities in the Burren. It is you who mobilized for change through highly effective local leadership. It is you who have applied good science to take account of your own unique ecosystem. It is you who are aware of their history and deep cultural roots to devise policies to shape your present and to plan for the future. And it is you who understand deeply that retaining a critical mass of farm families is an essential part of securing the Burren's future. These same principles are relevant to the community that Fiona and Anne care about and want to secure their future. These are the principles that will be relevant around the cabinet tables of any countries planning their future in sustainable food systems. And I think that's the background against which this Winterage festival is to be launched, and Brendan has asked me to formally do so. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Brendan, thank you.
That was a really wonderfully well prepared presentation and response to both what Anne and Fiona said, and also in anticipation of the weekend, the Winterage Weekend that lies ahead. So we've got about, I think, 8 minutes for questions, if you can type them into the Q&A function. But maybe Tom, to start with you, you've had such a long and illustrious career in agriculture and economics and third world development, and I suppose in many other hats as well. And I know you have a real interest in the future of Irish farming. How can you see that future evolve? What do you think will be different, for example, in maybe 20 or 30 years' time when we look at Irish agriculture?
I would contend, Brendan, that the Food Vision 2030 that you and I worked together on and that you made such an important contribution to actually sets a policy, a vision and a policy framework that is probably the best guarantee of a future for the agri-food sector that there currently is. And that, I think, inevitably is going to have to mean farming in a more sustainable way, in many cases in a less intensive way. And the issue of tackling some of the, in fact, all of the agri-environmental problems that are there at the moment has to be addressed very directly. At the same time, we were asked to talk about sustainability in its 3 dimensions of economic and social sustainability also. And we cannot get away from the fact that if farmers are to make their maximum contribution to tackling the range of challenges that they face, they need a decent income to do so. So there is going to have to be, real questions at national and EU level as to how farming and the rural communities are to be supported. And that insight that we're talking about rural communities, rural areas, economic activity in rural areas being an absolutely central part of any vision for the future of agriculture is also very, very, very correct. I think Ireland is in a position now where there is real opportunity that if we can achieve what we set out in Food Vision 2030 of becoming, and becoming a leader in sustainable food systems and being able to prove it. We can't just say we want to become a leader. We have to have the evidence to show that we are a leader. I think if we can achieve that over the next number of years, that's the best guarantee for a future for the people in the sector.
And Tom, sort of to follow on from that, and it's picking up on a question in the chat from Tom Tarper here, if you don't mind me interpreting a question for you, Tom. So at a time when I suppose there's a push towards being very efficient, as you have to be, where there's very little appetite for increasing food prices, when there's limits on the public purse, and when there's pressures, I guess, around climate and biodiversity loss, how do you envisage that you can square that circle around social and economic and environmental in a way that, for instance, a Burren farmer can continue to compete in future, where I guess, you know, if you're a farmer in the west of Ireland, maybe with 30 cattle, how can you compete with a much more efficient system in maybe elsewhere in the world, or even elsewhere in Ireland? How do you see that circle being squared?
Well, it can't be squared, I think, unless there is direct acknowledgement that the people, the Burren farmers, and it's not just the Burren farmers that this applies to, are actually supplying what you kept reminding us of, Brendan, during our work, ecosystem services that society needs to value more. And in that context, then that is the, you know, the political and, you know, moral basis for new imaginative schemes that you know, whereby people can be supported, and also, I suppose, doing things differently. I mean, there's a whole profusion of creativity, as far as I can see, in many parts of rural Ireland about new food products, about new income sources. The whole business of you know, if COVID has taught us anything, it is that, you know, people are going to be able to live and work in nice places like County Clare, and perhaps be able to generate income from where they are able to work. So there is an element here in the longer term of thinking about our human resources and how do we equip people with the education, skills, and human capital to enable them to take advantage of what's emerging as opportunities in this new era.
Yeah, and I think that's that term ecosystem services, which is a pretty awful term, let's face it, but I think that's what kind of, I suppose, Fiona and Anne would have shown tonight in the richness of their presentation and the images from it, and that's, I guess, what we boast about here in the Burren, and it's putting a value on those services which have often been taken for granted. I guess the only ecosystem service we typically pay for is food, and as you know yourself, that price is a lot less than it should be. Two quick comments, Tom. One from Tom Tarpey. Tom Tarpey asks about the food vision, or the 2030 food strategy. Will it align with the climate goals and address the biodiversity crisis? And if so, do you think it will bring about a reduction in the size of the national herd? And just one more question from Cormac Kelly. Thanks for the great presentation, Tom. Pastoral farming is clearly critical to the achievement of sustainable food systems and preservation of semi-natural grasslands in Ireland, but it has become increasingly economically unviable, especially for smaller farmers. Will Food Vision 2030 help to make this area of agriculture more profitable and attractive to younger farmers? So, two questions there to you, Tom.
On the issue of, you know, I suppose the agri-environment and the national heritage, we're faced with some very serious challenges here. There's no question about this. There is no way around the fact that farming has to deal with issues like water quality. It's just not on that production systems are going to lead to further deterioration in water quality and some of the other issues that have been resulting from expansion. But I think we need to have a measured approach towards this issue of the national herd. I think people are slipping into too much, if I may say, black and white conclusions here. I think the target for we need to be faced with here, we need to be focused on, is tackling the environmental problems. And if you can do that without reducing the national herd, that seems to me to be a more sensible approach. And I think that's what we should be setting out on. The second question.
It was about, I guess, the young people and will Food Vision 2030, especially for these small-scale pastoral systems.
Look, Food Vision 2030 is, and what's written in it, is not a magic wand. The reality is that there are many farms that are just, in terms of their size and scale of activity, are not going to provide an adequate income from farming. And if people want to retain their system of farming with that, they are actually going to have to find some alternative incomes. And that's where we come back to the question of, investing in rural areas with more economic opportunities, with more income opportunities. And certainly for young people, I think there's no way out of the fact that if they want a future, they're going to have to look to the skills that they acquire in their youth and in their continuing development to see, can they equip themselves with the skills and the income opportunities to get that, and to stay in the areas that they obviously want to stay in.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. I think we don't have time for much more questions. I was reminded of a conversation I had today with a colleague, James Moran, who you may know, Tom, as well, about the national herd, and making the point that there's not one national herd, there's several tens of thousands of them. And like here in the Burren, we need our animals for biodiversity. What we have, if not more, and elsewhere, then it's a whole different issue. So it's quite a complex thing. And you're right, you'll notice in any media interview that the question to the minister always is about the national herd. So I think it's way more complex than that. Pranjali, did you want to add anything?
No, I think I get the wonderful job of having to say bye and thank you to everyone, since it is 9 o'clock.
And before you do, Pranjali, and I hand back to you, I'd like to really, really thank our three speakers tonight. They put so much effort into attending and preparing tonight for this event. I'm so grateful, and I think it was the perfect way for us to connect with our global brethren, if you like, and also to launch this year's Burren Winter School. So I'm really grateful to Anne and Fiona and Tom. I know Tom has the benefit of being here this weekend to be part of the winter celebrations, but hopefully Anne and Fiona will join us here someday as well. So thanks all, and thanks to those who attended, and back to you, Pranjali.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone. And just if you haven't looked at our program, please take a look at burrenvinterage.com, and you might find something of interest. There's a lot of in-person events happening, but also there's another online talk tomorrow at 8 p.m. Irish time on farming and Irish writing with author Nicholas Green. And we'll also be joined by poet Jane Clark, who has written some wonderful poetry on the theme of living on the land. So I hope you'll join us for that. You can just register through burrenvinterage.com for that and for any other event that you're able to attend. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and have a very good evening.